It was Halloween night, the air thick with the chill of autumn. The moon, a sliver of silver, hung in the sky, casting eerie shadows on the quiet town of Hollow Creek. The streets were alive with children in costumes, their laughter and excitement echoing through the neighborhoods as they raced from house to house, filling their bags with candy. But away from the noise, tucked deep into the woods that bordered the town, a darker legend lurked. For as long as anyone could remember, parents warned their children never to wander too far from home on Halloween night, for fear of the Pumpkin Man. The Pumpkin Man was no ordinary figure. Legend said he had once been a farmer, a man named Samuel Greaves, who lived on the outskirts of Hollow Creek. Samuel had always been peculiar, a quiet man with no family and no friends. His only companions were the pumpkins he grew on his land. But the pumpkins weren't just ordinary crops, they grew unnaturally large and twisted, their skins hard and faces carved into grotesque grins. The townsfolk whispered that Samuel used dark magic to tend his crops, and over time, his pumpkins became cursed. On Halloween night, many years ago, a group of curious children ventured too close to Samuel's farm. They never returned. Since that night, the legend of the Pumpkin Man began. It was said that Samuel had sold his soul to dark forces, becoming a creature of the night, his face replaced by a carved pumpkin with a jagged, toothy grin. On Halloween, he would rise from the dead, wandering the town in search of new victims, especially those who strayed too far into the woods. But most believed it was just a story meant to keep children from wandering off. Most, but not all. Sarah and her friends, Jake, Emily, and Lucas, had heard the tale every year from their parents. This Halloween, they were no longer kids. At 16, they felt too old for trick-or-treating but still craved some mischief. Jake, always the bold one, suggested they explore the woods and find the old farm. "Come on, it'll be fun. It's just a stupid story, anyway. No one's ever seen the Pumpkin Man." Lucas hesitated, but Emily and Sarah nodded in agreement, their excitement outweighing their fear. Armed with nothing but flashlights and their bravado, they left the crowded streets behind and headed into the woods, following the narrow path that supposedly led to the abandoned farm. The deeper they ventured, the quieter it became. The sounds of laughter and footsteps from the town faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves in the wind. The trees, gnarled and twisted, seemed to close in on them, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. "Maybe we should turn back," Lucas muttered, glancing around nervously. Jake laughed. "What, scared already? We haven't even found the farm yet." Suddenly, Emily stopped. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. They all paused, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, they heard it, a scraping sound, like metal dragging against the ground. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "It's probably just the wind," she said, though she didn't believe her own words. The sound grew louder, closer. Jake shone his flashlight around, but the beam only illuminated the dense underbrush. "Come on," he said, though his voice wavered. "We're almost there." They pushed on, their footsteps quickening. The path grew narrower, the trees thicker, until they finally emerged into a clearing. There, in the center, stood the old farmhouse. It was dilapidated, its windows shattered, the wood rotting and sagging. But what drew their attention was the field behind it, rows and rows of pumpkins, each one larger and more twisted than the last. "I told you it was real," Jake exclaimed, stepping forward. But Sarah wasn't looking at the pumpkins. Her eyes were fixed on something else, something moving in the shadows at the edge of the field. She squinted, trying to make out the figure. It was tall, too tall to be a person. And then she saw it, its head. A large, carved pumpkin, the face grinning wickedly, the eyes hollow and glowing with an unnatural light. "Guys," Sarah's voice trembled. They all turned, their flashlights flickering over the figure. It was him, the Pumpkin Man. He stood there, silent and still, watching them with his carved eyes. In one hand, he held a sickle, the blade rusty and jagged. The other hand clutched a large pumpkin, its face carved with a grotesque smile. Jake swallowed hard. It's a costume. It has to be. The pumpkin man stepped forward, the sickle scraping against the ground. His movements were slow, deliberate. The sound of metal against earth sent chills down their spines. "Run!" Lucas shouted, and they did. They sprinted back through the woods, the trees blurring past them. The sound of the pumpkin man's footsteps followed, heavy and relentless, as though he was just behind them, always just a step away. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs felt like lead, but she didn't dare stop. She could hear Emily's sobs, Lucas's panicked breathing, and Jake's labored steps. The town felt so far away, the woods endless. Suddenly, Emily tripped and fell, her scream piercing the night. Sarah skidded to a halt and turned back. "Emily!" Jake grabbed her arm. "We can't, he's coming." But Sarah couldn't leave her behind. She tore herself free from Jake's grip and ran back to Emily, pulling her to her feet. Emily's ankle was twisted, and she limped as they hurried forward, but the pumpkin man was closing in. They could hear the scraping of the sickle, the heavy footsteps. And then, just as they reached the edge of the woods, the sound stopped. Sarah looked back, her breath catching in her throat. The pumpkin man was standing at the tree line, watching them, the sickle resting at his side. He didn't chase them any further, but his hollow eyes never left theirs. They stumbled back into town, breathless and shaking. The streets were still filled with children in costumes, oblivious to the terror that lurked just beyond the woods. Sarah, Jake, Emily, and Lucas collapsed on a bench, their faces pale, their hearts still racing. Did you see him?" Lucas panted. "He was real." Jake nodded, his bravado gone, replaced by fear. "We're never going back there. Ever." And from that night on, the four friends never spoke of the pumpkin man again. But every Halloween, as the moon rose high and the children of Hollow Creek laughed and played, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the pumpkin man was still watching, waiting for the next group of curious souls to wander too far into the woods. And she knew, deep down, that the legend was more than just a story. Because some legends never die. They just wait in the shadows, grinning, with their sickles ready to strike.